So I think it's the overall approach, the overall thought, right? We're there to kind of help lead and coach our clientele. A lot of it's a mindset. I was there I wasn't there just to do my job, right? I was trying to figure out what would be best for the client. I really spent a lot of time trying to understand the client and guide them from wherever I was at. If I was in there as, let's just say, an individual contributor, I was looking around, where are the gaps, things like that. And I was trying to help educate the client.
Welcome to the Forward Slash, where we lean into the future of IT. I am Aaron Chesney with my co-host James Carmen. James, who do we have that we're interviewing today?
Well, it is my pleasure to say we have Mark Wehby, a good friend of mine from Callibrity. He's the CEO of Callibrity, joining us today. Mark, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Mark Wehby. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Callibrity, which has been around since 2007. I have two adult children, Ryan Wehby, who's 22, and my daughter Hannah, who's 21, and my spouse of 22 years, Rachel Wehby.
And then your mother's maiden name and social security number, just for the record?
Well, my mom's maiden name is. Nice try there, Aaron. A little bit about Callibrity before we kick off. We started in 2007, and it was just Gary and I. And actually, James Carmen, when we first started, we were in the basement of P&G, and we formed a small company primarily to keep other, well, there's a few things we were trying to accomplish, but thinking about it a little bit higher level, we were independents in this. We formed a company, and there's a lot of benefits to being a small company as opposed to three independents. And shortly after that, James kind of left the company. He had a lot of other external responsibilities, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he had a lot of competing priorities, and at that time for the size of the company that he decided to focus elsewhere. And so we stayed in that business model roughly till 2014 or so, and we landed a client with enough of a footprint that we had the revenue, and Gary volunteered and did a great job. He stepped out of day-to-day consulting and focused more on business development. And shortly thereafter, we started hiring full-time employees, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and I think something really cool about that, employee number one is still with Callibrity to this day. So even all that time ago, he's still with us. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a rare thing these days.
Absolutely. So we had a list of questions we wanted to kind of go through with you, Mark, if that's all right with you. First, tell us maybe a little bit about what got you into software engineering. How did you get involved in our field at first?
It's a great question. So during my grade school, we had a computer lab, and we got to go visit the computer lab once a week, and it was full of Commodore 64s, which I believe were even outdated at that time. And it was cool. It was very interesting. There were the old games on the Commodore 64 that attracted me to computers, but also we got to do some coding in, I believe it was BASIC. There was a lot, line numbers were important. We could draw little dots, little asterisks, and things like that. And I really, really enjoyed that. And that's really what got me going in this field. So
nice.
I had a similar experience with the way I got started. Mine was an IBM desktop, and put in a bunch of game code in BASIC from a Tandy book, and because it was Tandy to IBM, and we sat there, and it was a father-son thing that we would do, and sit there and debug the things. So, respect to the old systems.
I typed my first program in with an Atari 2600 joystick. So, yeah, not too easy, going left, press the button to type each letter. It was, painstaking. It's a wonder that I still do this.
The little Atari keyboard that they had?
No,
Oh,
I
I
didn't
had
have
that
one.
one for the Basic A cartridge.
No, I had to type it in old school. It was pretty crazy. So when it comes to running and creating a company, it's a daunting thing to do. Like what made you want to start a company like Callibrity? What was the kind of the inspiration? You went over it a little bit in your intro, but I mean, tell us a little bit more about
Sure. So I was lucky enough to be recruited by a consulting company out of college, software architects, and you would see that name quite a bit in this area if you looked around for people roughly in the same years of experience or came out of college around that area. There's a lot of former software architects, both at Callibrity and in the Cincinnati area. I'm sure in other areas too. They had quite a presence in Columbus. So they did a lot of things right. They definitively are not. They were not the same business model or the consulting space that we are currently trying to evolve to and aspire to. But they hired a lot of really smart people right out of college, and it was a great environment for both learning and getting exposure to a lot of different clients and business models. So, originally I wanted to Gary and I and James, when we very very first started out, right, we were trying to create a company we'd want to work for our whole careers.
Yeah, I like you mentioned that software architects hired a bunch of really smart people, but I would like to point out they also hired me. So there was the other side of the equation, So
There's always an exception to the rule.
right,
Yeah,
yeah. So you can't hit a home run every time. You know what I
right.
mean?
When you think about it too, though, right? They did hire a lot of smart people, and jokingly and not jokingly aside, right? But there's a lot of skills that go into consulting that are not directly related, I think, to overall intelligence, right? You have to have the personality and social skills to be a good consultant. So
Takes a little bit of charisma. Takes that presence. I think is kind of how I phrase it a lot of times when I'm talking to people about consulting.
I,
Um,
I
yeah,
love
go ahead.
getting good presents.
Hold on, we got to throw this in there. Um, Mark, can you share a moment you can look back on your career that something that might have been inspirational to you, or just something that significantly influenced your approach and how you thought about what we do in this crazy world we call software engineering?
I think there's a few, but when I thought about this, when I think about it now, and just pull it back to me personally, back in the late 90s, I was on a client project as a consultant and on the Java side of things, and it struck me how non-object oriented the approach was we were taking to build the software we were building. We were building it in Java, which is inherently object oriented. Domain driven languages and domain driven approaches really weren't around then like they are now. The thought, the books and things like that. So I took some time and I started to go back to what I learned in college around object-oriented programming, and I started to design an domain model without knowing what it was called. And I spent a lot of time actually at the client, but in a non-billable capacity, exploring that. At the end of the day, what we delivered was very procedural in manner, and that's the way it worked. But I did spend time exploring that, and then not long after that, I was lucky enough to attend a not no fluff just stuff in Cincinnati, and saw Rod Johnson present on Spring, and I'm like, holy smokes! And then you could see the evolution to where we're at now.
So, have you ever done something like that where you learned uh, a a thing on your own that didn't have a label, and then on an interview or in a conversation, somebody asked if you did something and didn't realize that what you had done was this label that they were throwing out?
Maybe not exactly that, but yeah, for most of my career, I've had to learn a lot of things in a self motivated, self directed way. And I've often been in meetings or in interviews where that's come into play. Once I start learning something, I'm generally not blazing the path completely, right? So there's usually a name or at least some concepts floating around about the things we're attempting to do. So, but as a side note, just real quick, one of the things I do is if I'm ever in a meeting and I hear technology I don't know about, I jot it down and I immediately educate myself after the meeting. So that's been really useful throughout my career as a consultant and even a CEO.
I think one of the things, I don't remember what I called it, but I came up with like an object relational mapper type. I think everybody's done that, right? We've all written that in the past, and I thought I was, coming up with, the next best thing. Of course, when I was at the client, I didn't know anything about it, what it was. So I came up with some name for it, and then when I learned about it, I was like, oh, I like that name better. Like somebody else came up with a much better name than whatever I came up with, and I think that was the one technology that I did messed up the name for.
This might be a little bit of a tangent, but when I worked with James early in our career, what then became named servlet chaining, James was excited and walked a group of us through that on a whiteboard while we were on they called it the beach at Software Architects. James, you'd have to go into more detail on that one, but I don't know if that was something you blazed or not, but it did get a name later on.
Yeah, I don't remember that one. The one I do remember writing that ended up it was very much similar to what Struts, when they came out with Struts. I wrote something very similar to Struts on an airplane one time on my way to San Francisco. And and then like a few years later, of course, Struts came out. I was like, oh man, they did it so much better than I did. But what the heck, right?
So James is kind of the Ted Lasso of IT.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, we know that's from this. We've done that before. It's like,
Yeah.
yes, but we're going to do it right.
Right. I came up with this play,
Right.
and I think y'all should. Oh yeah, we know about that. That's called this. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, whatever. I invented that. What are you talking about? So, Mark, you've been doing the CEO thing for a little while, but it isn't your background. I mean, you didn't go to college for that. You don't have an MBA or anything like that. But when looking back on your experience and what you've learned and how you've grown through the years, is there anything that you would, an aspiring young CEO, and any advice you would give, or if you could go back in time and give yourself advice when you first said, oh, hey, now I'm the CEO of Callibrity, like what would you smack yourself upside the head and say, hey, dummy, don't do this? Like anything like that you would care to share?
There's a lot. There's a lot, right? There's a lot to being a CEO. There's a lot to starting a business and then getting that business to the current size Callibrity is. So it was really hard, or it is really hard to kind of do this, give that advice in such a succinct manner. But trying to think through the whole journey, the one thing I would concentrate on if I was aspiring to be a CEO right now, and I guess it wouldn't even matter what size the company is, right? So that's how I'm trying to frame this. So, do a lot of self-reflecting, figure out what your strengths are. And, it's interesting because most of us, I think, are good or at least average at most things, hence the term average, right? But what are you really good at? What are your real true strengths? And then you need to figure out a way to address your weaknesses. So, as the company grows, you'll have the luxury of hiring people around you. For instance, Callibrity's executive team right now, we complement each other skill set wise, and to a little bit personality wise, and that's just an example, right? There's other ways that you can augment or supplement your skill set, that doesn't necessarily mean hiring someone. So, but I think that's the number one thing.
Yeah, and a couple good ways of getting a start at understanding kind of yourself is there's the Briggs and Myers test, which will give you a personality profile with some descriptions on kind of where some of your strengths lies. There's also something out there that I've done before called Strength Finder that will kind of give you the different types of strengths that you have that you could gravitate to. I know for myself, someone called me a maker once, and I'm like, and it made me think about it. And sure enough, yeah, I really enjoy making things. And that's why, I gravitate towards software. I get to make applications and see them run and get the enjoyment of seeing it all work. And that kind of led me in my career path. So I like that advice.
So, Mark, as you're talking about complementing your weaknesses and stuff, there's you can kind of go through almost a build versus buy, right? Of a decision on some of those weaknesses. Some of them you just have to kind of bone up on it yourself, and some of it you hire to fill in those gaps. So how do you go about maybe making those decisions of which one is a build versus buy? What goes into that type of decision?
I think that's a great question, James, and putting some thought into that and reflect on what you said a little bit. You do have to have a basic understanding of some of the core concepts around business, right? An easy example would be finances, right? Like you have to understand a certain level of that, and then as the company evolves and grows, more than likely, depending on your background, you are going to get to the point where you're no longer good enough at that, right? Like your skill set, it would take too much effort to get to that level and years of experience. An example of that is we have Terry Farrow now as our CFO, and I could try and spend as much time or effort as possible to get to his level, but he has a whole career doing that, right? So at some point you will outstripe your talent level. And I think for this particular case, and to answer your question a little more directly, there are core things that are really important to Callibrity as a business, right? There are things that make us stand out in the marketplace where we're trying to position ourselves, and our ability to our finances, right, don't directly impact that, right? So I try to steer my effort towards things that make Callibrity unique and you know answer that question for clients, why, or potential clients too, like why Callibrity, right? So our ability to do our books, and Terry's taken us to a whole nother level, and we needed it right at our current size. But I try to focus on things that are directly impact Callibrity's ability to get to where we want to be as a company.
I love that you started off that by talking about like how you educated yourself in areas where finances, that's not one of your specialties, but you did at least educate yourself, so you didn't like completely abdicate all of those responsibilities immediately. You at least educated yourself to a level, but you saw that you were running out of like space to grow in that area, and then that's when you need to bring someone in. That's an interesting approach. Thank you for that. What about in our world of software engineering, things change so much. How do you stay informed? How do you understand what are the latest developments and trends, and how do you incorporate that into your work?
So that's a great question, James. So this is going to be an interesting answer at the beginning, but so I read a lot, right? I take in a lot of information from a lot of different sources, even sources I know I'm not going to agree with, right? So there's from overall perspective, I feel the need to keep up with macroeconomic trends, right? Because that affects our ability to do business. So there's trends in sales and marketing that I try to stay at least a little bit abreast of. But for our core competencies as a company, so I read a lot of blogs. I look at a lot of technical radars. The more and more the bigger Callibrity gets, I have to lean on our CTO a little bit, right, to stay abreast of what's going on. I also talk to our practice leads, and that helps a lot. So it is getting harder and harder the larger we get, but I would say it's more I stay abreast of the abstract ideas, the big concepts, and I don't have the time to deep dive like I used to, and actually do. I do still do personal projects where I'll stand up a full stack and mess around at the house. But I'm finding time to do that is harder and harder. So I have to rely on the overall team and the company. But I do a lot of reading. The pragmatic engineering email is great. ThoughtWorks, right? They produce a radar. I've been following that for a long time. So
So
early.
you mentioned you read things that you don't necessarily you're not going to agree with. I found that interesting. Why do you read those types of things?
I think it keeps you well rounded, right? I think the concepts are still important to understand, uh, even if your position's different than the author's position. Um,
Have you ever been surprised by something that you read in one of those that you're like, oh, I kind of see your point?
yeah, it's hard to come up with an example off the top of my head, but absolutely, there's been times where I've either learned something new and or changed my position on something based on what I read or podcasts I've listened to. Um, so I do think it's important to at the CEO level, it's breadth of knowledge a lot more I'm finding than it is the ability, to deep dive on one particular topic. So, and that's a change a little bit from being a day-to-day consultant. Although over the years, I did accumulate, right, a large breadth of knowledge.
Yeah, I think being intentional about seeking out those potential blind spots that you may have, I think that's pretty smart, Mark, that you seek out opposing viewpoints because it can help you grow, and that's a neat um, aspect of your learning. What about if you ever had any sort of an example of a time when you were working on a project where you faced a particularly tough challenge or a challenging problem or setback that uh, you went through, and how did you overcome that?
So that's a great question too. So early on in my career, that I'll give two quick answers because I think they're both kind of important. So, um, I found myself pretty far behind a deadline. Back then things weren't agile, even lowercase a, on the first few projects I was on. So, you go through at least that point in my career, my overall, growth wasn't there yet. So it's interesting how much angst that caused me. And then I went to my tech lead at the time, and luckily, as soon as I realized it, I maybe struggled thinking through this, for maybe a couple hours, and I just went to them and I said, "Listen, this deadline, I know I did the estimates on it, but it's no longer attainable." And it's easy now looking back at that moment in time, right? Well, of course, the sooner you get that information into the hands of the people that can actually help with the deadline, moving the deadline, right, the better. It gives them options. James Carmen, give you a little bit of credit. James and I have worked together quite a bit over the years, right? And so he says it now, right? The time that I'm maybe not going to say it correct, James, but that it gives options, right? The sooner the more options you have to address that you're not going to hit that deadline. So management can help move deadlines out. They can push marketing campaigns, all that. But if you hold that to yourself and then you miss the deadline, right, and that's going to be a much bigger deal because the client or the company has less time to react to it. And I think that's a big thing. And then kind of similarly, if you're running into a problem, I do think you give it a shot, right? You give the effort to solve it on your own as best you can, but you really have to keep in mind the overall uh, amount of time you spend on that trying to solve it. You should time box it. And if you hit the end of that time box, you should reach out to coworkers and get the help because you have to be humble enough to understand that you can't solve everything and that they're going to have experiences that you haven't and they can absolutely help. So I've seen both of those play out many times in my career.
For those listening at home, just to fill you in, so Mark mentioned the lowercase a agile. And for those that may not know, the difference between lowercase a agile and uppercase a agile is the amount of implementation in a given company for how they're following agile practices. So lowercase a would be just like a touch point. Maybe you've got like a storyboard that you're following, but you're not following any other practices that are like iterative in that kind of stuff with the agile methodologies. And the capital A agile is whole hog. We're all going agile all the time, and we're pulling in frameworks and experts and coaches and doing all that. So that's the capital A agile. Just wanted to clarify on that.
Yeah, I think my spiel on that topic, Aaron, is a little nuanced. It's the same. The gist of it is the same as what you're saying, but like I think of like when I think of like lowercase agile, it's sticking to the principles, the agile principles, right? From the manifesto, just sticking to the principles and not so much being dogmatic about a particular, are we doing safe or are we doing scrum or are we doing XP or, you know what I mean? Like like you said, getting very litigious about it. That sort of stuff is just, that's the big A agile. And that's where, a lot of companies have gotten a bad rap for, pushing these methodologies and frameworks when it's really, you really need to stick to applying those concepts. I think is where that little A agile comes into play, I think.
And I find it helpful to go back and read the manifest every once in a while just to refresh myself. It's like, am I still being agile or am I fooling myself?
Absolutely, absolutely. Mark, you mentioned it's interesting that the experience you had with do you dig into a problem and knowing when to raise your hand and say, hey, I need help. It in my experience, the the junior level folks or the associates in our industry, you kind of get one or the other, and it's on the extremes. It's hardly ever that people land on that kind of middle ground ever. It's either I never want to dig in at all, and I raise my hand immediately, or I sit and work on something for 2 weeks straight and banging my head against it, and I end up in a padded room, right? Those are the two extremes you experience. So landing on that sweet spot is hard. And you mentioned humility. That's a big part of it, is being able to humble yourself and say, I need help, and understand that. So that's great. Thank you. When it comes to being, leading a company, could you identify just a key couple of like skills or maybe even attributes of a person that a person would have or need to have in order to be an effective CEO?
I think there's a few comes to mind, at least for a company like Callibrity. Collaboration, right, and communication. They're two sides of the same coin in a lot of cases. So I think it's really important. And I mentioned building a team around you that complements your skill set, and then you have to be able to collaborate, right, with that team. And then I think another thing that, at least for me, is important is thinking through how you message things, and both internally and externally. They're equally important, and you have to do it often, and and I think those are really important for a CEO. And also realize, right, like it's a team sport. I truly believe that. And then at the end of the day, there are decisions there are times when you have to make a decision, and you can collaborate too much, and ultimately a decision has to be made, and there'll be multiple opinions, but you know you have to make one at the end of the day. And sometimes the decisions can be really hard because they affect people's lives, but we're blessed to be in an industry where I think there's a little less impact most of the time when you have to make those truly hard decisions. And the interesting concept. I think there's different types of CEOs, and some excel in other ways in other situations. And you just saw that goes to the collaboration and teamwork. If the company hits a time when your skill set's not the best for that part of the company's journey, you have to bring in and or delegate and find the skill sets you need to put on the team. So
Yeah, I think there was the great philosopher Robert Van Winkle once said that you need to stop, collaborate, and listen. You know what I mean? Like those are important things to keep in mind as a leader. I think every now and then.
absolutely, absolutely.
he was a great philosopher.
Yes, if you put that with a
And
certain
an okay
rhythm,
rapper too.
Yeah,
yeah,
he was all right. He had some
Yeah.
moves. Dude could dance, right?
you could put that. You could put that philosophy to like a musical beat, and you could
Yeah.
probably come up with something pretty powerful
Yeah.
there.
Something like
Yeah,
stop, collaborate, and listen.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's nice. I like
Love
that.
it.
So, what about if what kind of advice would you give someone if they were wanting to start a business, like from scratch, from the ground up, and what kind of advice would you give someone like that?
It can be quite the journey, right? So it's hard. There's no shortcuts. There, sometimes I think companies that get started and they're lucky enough to be, caught up in a wave or something like that, and they're successful pretty quickly. But the majority of businesses are not like that. There's a lot of hard work. Um, there's a lot of times where you get discouraged and you have to work through them. From a different perspective too, right? I have a very um, trusting, and you should, right? My wife's very trusting. She has a high tolerance for issues that arise sometimes as one of the co-founders of Callibrity, because there are times where it affects and spills over to the family, right? So that learning how to separate the two, and you can't really successfully do it. At least I couldn't, right? There's work-life balance is important, but it's hard to do total separation. So that's another maybe something that you could take away as a CEO. That's a good skill to develop, to figure out how to minimize the impact to your family, and then also be able to step away, relax a little bit, right? You gotta spend that time with the family, and when you do it, you should focus. Try to turn off the business side of your brain and focus. Be present, right? There's books around this concept, so
So, Mark, you have an interesting background with being a CEO that's actually been in the trenches doing the work that your employees do, and that seems to be non-typical of your CEO. Most of them are school learned or brought in by a VC to manage a company instead of actually understanding the work that's being done at the lowest levels. But you've been there. How do you think that's helped you mold Callibrity into what it is?
that's a great question, Aaron. So I do think that's important, especially in the type of company Callibrity is aspiring to be. So knowing some of the day-to-day challenges that being a consultant entails, and also being a consultant at different levels of experience. I was, in the field, so to speak, for 17, 18 years as a consultant. So it's not just, early in my career or late, at a high level. It's been through the whole journey. And I think that is important. I can very much empathize with the day-to-day challenges of being a consultant and interacting with clients, right? That's a skill set that's important. Um, but I think that speaks to making sure I surround myself with people that do understand a business and do understand how to scale it. Because that's something I've not done. Now I do have experience doing that at this point in my career, but early on I did not. Right, so and as we grow, that those skills become more and more important. So the Callibrity as a company has to figure out how to address that. But to bring it back to your question, I do think it's very important for our type of company. Otherwise, I think it's a slippery slope to going, and there's nothing wrong with these business models, but I think it's a slippery slope to go to the more augmentation type of consulting company, or one where the easy answers seem to make a lot of sense, but you don't truly understand the impact of that, right? So um, let me thinking through that, right? Like why it's so important for the things we're trying to do, right? Continuous education of our workforce, team-based initiatives, things along those lines. I think it's more and more important that we stay in touch with that.
So what would you say the difference is between consulting and staff augmentation? Because there's a lot of places out there that call themselves consultants, but they end up doing that staff augmentation, like you said.
So I think there's a little bit that goes into that. So I think it's the overall approach, the overall thought, right? We're there to kind of help lead and coach our clientele. And I think that's really important. And it's easier to do when we're positioned the way we're trying to position ourselves. And I do think, there's been times in my early career where I was just a staff augmentation consultant, even though I didn't know at the time I was behaving more like a strategic type of consultant. So there's times you can do embedded leadership and things like that. But I think it's a lot of it's a mindset. I was there I wasn't there just to do my job, right? I was trying to figure out what would be best for the client. I really spent a lot of time trying to understand the client and guide them from wherever I was at my point in career and the service that I was providing for that client. So if I was in there as, let's just say, an individual contributor, I was looking around where are the gaps, things like that, and I was trying to help educate the client at whatever level I happen to be at. And I think that mindset is one of the biggest things that distinguishes that between a consultant and just staff augmentation or a contractor.
So as a CEO of a company, what keeps you up at night besides coffee?
That's a great question. So, I think it's changed over time. So early on in Callibrity's life cycle, a lot of it was around cash flow and sales, right? And so now where we're currently at, what kind of keeps me up at night is, and to be honest with you, since our current executive team and it's not just the executive team. So I just want to make sure I make that clear. Where Callibrity currently is, there's not really much that keeps me up at night, but I think that's a combination of many things, right? So we've grown as a company to where we're currently at, and we have a lot of leaders in the company from top to bottom. So everything from individual consultants that have kind of stepped up and taken on more, and to CAs and DAs to practice leads there's just a lot of leadership. And I think a lot of that goes back to, our hiring practices and our philosophy overall and where we're trying to position ourselves.
And CAs are our consultant advisors, and DAs are our
delivery advocates.
delivery advocates. Okay.
They're like a liaison between our clients and our delivery teams. So, I think we've done a good job of putting a structure in place where we have leaders throughout the organization. We have we do have a lot of things to work on, and we have a lot of places we can grow, and maybe getting a little more systematic around growing leaders and making helping natural leaders kind of get better at what they do. So that, helping them on their journey. I think Callibrity, that's, an area of growth for us here in the near future.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that. You talked about surrounding yourself with good folks, and in some sense, I think what you've done with the keeping you up at night type of stuff is you've delegated that mostly to me. I think I'm the one that's staying up at night worrying about the things. That's why Mark gets to sleep so nicely. So, Mark, when you look back on, you and I both worked for software architects coming out of college, and I think our perspective, your perspective changes over time just naturally anyway. But we have an interesting point, or you do, to look back on your perspective as an individual contributor, as a consultant working for a consulting company, and then as the CEO running that consulting company. In some sense, we were probably a little naive to all of the goings on behind the scenes and whatnot. What was probably the most surprising thing maybe that you can think of that you were unaware of at that time that now you're like, I wish I would have known. I might have been a little more, I don't know, empathetic towards leadership, because this job is not easy. But anything you can think of along those lines?
Yeah, that's a great question, James. So when I think back of to myself when I was at Software Architects, right? We jokingly called the non-consultants blood sucking overhead, right? And I get it, right? That's a funny term, and to a certain degree, right? It's the part of the organization that isn't doing the day-to-day work, so to speak. And that's kind of how I thought about it, especially early in my career. So when I think about one of the things I learned a lot about when starting Callibrity and being part of this side of the house, so to speak, being part of that blood sucking overhead, is it's a lot of work to have a functioning company, and there's a lot of effort and talent that I didn't necessarily have a respect for that goes into running a company. So I'll just pick an easy one for me, because as a software developer, true sales, like my knowledge of sales in particular, especially early on in my career, I'm like, well, how hard is it, right? Like, you just make some phone calls. Like, we got a skill set everybody wants, right? Like, clients should just be calling us. They should be falling in our laps, right? But marketing and sales is hard, and it's a skill set it took me a long time to appreciate. But I mean, you could rinse and repeat that. HR, all those types of things.
Yeah, anybody that thinks sales is easy should watch Tommy Boy. That's a perfect example of how hard sales can be.
Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman. Right? Yeah.
Well, another
Yeah.
aspect of that too is the expense, right? Like, it takes a lot to run a company. So to fully understand that at the level I do currently as CEO, it was somewhat of a surprise, the effort and the expense it takes to run a company. So
Yeah, I think I had the same, and we called the non-billable staff the blood sucking overhead back in the day. We kind of looked at it selfishly, at least I did. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I kind of looked at that as like, those are the reason that I can't make a better salary, right? Like that, because we have to pay all these people, right? That's how kind of I approached it back in my naive days. But I guess I have to think back of some of those folks that, the way we like to think of ourselves, the non-billable people working at Callibrity is we're the support staff, right? So we're there to support, and I think looking back on our the people that were involved with us, like the Greg Moorfields and the Gene Gelassi's of the world that were there helping us to learn and grow along the way, probably didn't have as much appreciation for all the stuff they did for us. Looking back on it now, I can see that it probably wasn't an easy job guiding a young James Carman that's fresh out of college when I knew everything. You know what I mean? It's
So,
hard to teach me.
What's changed?
Not much. It's just I don't have them anymore. They're not here, so
Right.
I have to figure it out on my own now.
Yeah, but you still come up as everything. So,
Well, I've known everything since I got out of college.
right, there you go.
I just haven't learned anything since. That's the problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark, for your time and your insights into the life of a CEO. Thank you to my co-host, James Carman, and our editing and production staff that put this lovely production together. Stay tuned for our next episode on the // where we lean into the future of IT.